Hey, everybody, and welcome to Build and Breakthrough. I'm your host, Hunter Harris. And with me today is Jeff Goldblatt. He's a founder, mentor, advisor, and coach. He's one of the fellow advisors of the Atlanta Tech Village. He's actually the creator of the original rejection hotline, and he's an expert in virality. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So I kind of stumbled into entrepreneurship. I'd always been a creative entrepreneurial person, but as far as a formal startup goes, I'd just gotten out of college at Emory University, and I put up this funny thing as a joke for my friends, called it the rejection hotline. It was like this funny fake phone number you can give out if you don't want to give out your real number, and it plays a funny-ish message letting the person know, sorry, they didn't want you to have their real number. It went super viral, started reaching millions of people, started getting all kinds of national media coverage. And I was like, well, I'm a smart guy. I've always done well in school. I should be able to turn that into millions of dollars real quick. Well, fast forward several years, and I half jokingly dubbed myself America's worst entrepreneur because I was reaching millions of people, getting all this media coverage. I was speaking at conferences as an expert in viral marketing and creativity and advertising and content creation. And everybody assumed we were crushing it on the business side because how could we not be? I mean, everybody had heard of us. Yeah, on the revenue side, we were not crushing it. We were crushing it by what I call vanity metrics. So I eventually took a long look in the mirror and fired myself as CEO of my own company, brought in a much more experienced operator with complementary skill sets. And it was night and day after I did that. Within a month, we had raised $1 million in funding. Within 6 months, we were a profitable 7-figure company after years of me wearing all the hats as an inexperienced solo founder and not knowing what I didn't know. And I don't think I'd ever heard the term self-awareness at the time. I definitely had none. And that was kind of not only the impetus for the success of that first startup, but it kind of began my fascination, borderline obsession with self-awareness or lack thereof in founders, and just how much the average first-time or inexperienced founder just doesn't know that they don't know. And now fast forward many years, and I've now mentored and advised hundreds, if not 1,000 plus founders, been involved with several startups myself, and kind of seen a lot, and I've seen repetitive patterns, and I kind of became fascinated by all of the redundant learning curves and kind of the same problems and pitfalls that befall many, many, many founders. And I will say, a warning, I've been called a negative Nancy or a Debbie Downer. I prefer to consider myself more of a realistic Rick, but a lot of my obsession is based on the kind of the status quo success fail rate in entrepreneurship and startups. And I do talk a lot about the problems and the pitfalls and the failures and the failure factors. But to be clear, I still love entrepreneurship, love startups, startup communities, everything about the entrepreneurship ecosystem. But I feel like there's some things that can be improved upon.
Absolutely agree. I guess that's a pretty seamless transition to a topic that talked about a bunch. Not only in the prep call that we did, but also several times just in our chats at ATV. Selection bias. What is it, and why should founders care about it?
I mean, it shows up in so many different ways in entrepreneurship, but I mean, from a simplest perspective is you're going to hear about all the massive success stories. And not only that, but all those massive success stories all likely have hundreds of employees who all have hundreds of friends who are all hearing about how much we're crushing it. And we just raised this round of funding, and all the media coverage, whether it's local media or social media or Entrepreneur Magazine, Inc., Fortune, all that, they're all going to be covering the big success stories because that's what's sexy. And every once in a while, you might hear a failure story mixed in, but you would literally need to hear like 99 failure stories for every one success story to get a statistically relevant and representative sample size. So when
We do
founders
not.
we do not. And honestly, I'm not suggesting that they should do that because that would be terrible media to be reading 99 failure stories all the time.
And probably be
But
bad
that's,
for their numbers, which is why they don't do it, right?
yeah, nobody wants to see that. But as a result of that, the average founder, aspiring founder, gets kind of seduced by the success stories and by like the big and your brain can't possibly wrap its head around what the actual stats are and just what the odds are, because and on a personal level, like as I've been doing a ton of mentoring and advising, I have the close relationships and conversations with people going through the really bad stuff who are struggling and failing. And while that might just be a statistic or a rounding error to the top of the ecosystem funnel, the Y Combinators, the Techstars, all the incubators and accelerators and programs and entrepreneurship programs at every college in the country, it's the ecosystem itself survives and thrives with a roughly 1% success rate. And depending on what your definitions of success and failure are, different people will say it's a 99% failure rate or a 90%, 95, whatever. I actually think it's greater than 99% fail because I count all the people who are attempting to build a startup, most of whom, if they never get to a point of raising funding or making a dollar, never get counted as a startup because they've never even cracked that initial threshold. So regardless of what numbers you use, the vast majority are going to struggle and fail. And the ecosystem as a whole survives and thrives with that status quo success fail rate. And I'm not saying that they have some plot or nefarious intention of like making life miserable for the 99% that are going to fail. But it's just, it's how it is. Startups are hard. And, we tell people startups are hard and they still do it anyway. And that's true. I mean, if 99% fail, 100% roughly are going to feel like they will be the 1%, which is crazy math. And as a result, they don't really know what they're getting themselves into. They also don't know. Another piece of survivorship bias is even the massive success stories. So I don't even know if I answered what survivorship bias is in general yet, but and you're basically just hearing the survivors of this huge journey, and you're just not going to get it.
It's that classic picture of the, World War II bomber, where there's all the red dots over it, and people are like, yeah, so like let's slap some armor everywhere the planes got shot. And I forget exactly which mathematician it was or statistician it was. They were like, oh, no. Don't put armor where the shots are. Put armor everywhere the shots aren't. Because wherever there aren't red dots, that means the bullet hit the vehicle and it crashed.
Those are the planes.
It was not
those
successful.
Are the planes that didn't make it. That didn't make it back.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's the planes that survived. So the bias towards only the signal that made it through.
Yeah. And even within the 1%, the big success stories, you're never going to hear about everything that they did before their big success that prepared them for that. So you and I are at the Atlanta Tech Village. David Cummings, one of the best, most influential entrepreneurs in Atlanta. Everybody talks about how he started Pardot and it was this huge success and he sold for whatever it was, $95 million. And then that led to the creation of the Atlanta Tech Village. You have to dig deep into his blog history to like blog number 392 to see that he had a baseball card flipping business and a flea market business and a hamster breeding business and a software, like the reps that he got with all of these other business ventures. Another one of the Tech Village's Taupe, who created Calendly. So on neither of their LinkedIn pages are you going to see those businesses that they got their reps with. Taupe had tried to start an online dating business and like a grill e-commerce store or something like that.
Yeah, Taupe had like 8 or 9 things before he stumbled into Calendly, I believe. It was a ton of stuff. If you talk to him one-on-one, he will tell you about that. But
absolutely.
He's not transmitting that.
Yes. He's not hiding it, but it's just like we were talking about earlier. It's not a sexy story. Nobody cares about that in retrospect. And like, of course, you're not going to have something that you did 20 years ago that was like 27 ventures ago featured on your LinkedIn page or in your bio or whatever. Of course not.
Yeah. Don't focus on my 95 million exit. Let me tell you about my baseball card trading business.
Yeah, of course not. So I'm not faulting any of those people for that.
Yeah,
that's just the way it is. But as a result of that, I've been mentoring and advising a long time now, and I'll get a lot of people who it's their first time trying to create a startup. And they just have this confidence about them that, yeah, I'm going to be successful. I'm smart and I'm capable and I'm dedicated to this and I'm going to try really hard. They don't understand that even the successes that they're trying to emulate did it in a very different way and had a lot more experience and a lot more reps under their belt. That's we're not going to get into what my future stuff is that I'm working on, but one of the things I want to do is create the kind of minor leagues of entrepreneurship
Hmm.
to intentionally give future founders those reps on businesses that don't matter, that are throwaway projects, that are a month or 3 months or 6 months, intended just to get the reps. Because if it's your first time trying to start a business and you've got this innovative new idea, but it's also your first time putting up a website, your first time hiring employees or interns, or figuring out all the tools that we take for granted, like Slack and Calendly and Zoom. And like,
Hmm.
there's nothing hard about those per se, but there are learning curves involved. And if you're going
And
through
there's
all
a
those
lot
learning
of learning
curves,
curves too.
and if you're going through all those learning curves at the same time you're trying to create your new innovative
It's
business, like, of
brutal.
course it's going to be incredibly difficult. But people just get blinded by this excitement and passion and optimism. And I always feel bad talking like this because I understand the value of positive thinking and optimism and encouragement. But at the expense of reality, people need to know what the game is that they're playing, what the likely timelines are. And a lot of entrepreneurs don't.
So that actually transitions to something that's been a recurring theme on this podcast a little bit. So I would say, like, man, there's a lot here to unpack, but temperamentally, one of the core traits that I'd really look for in founders is kind of a duality, right? There's the duality of I am going to be self-confident enough to spit in the face of reality, because you have to have that with the odds. Like you cannot build a large or a great company if you're a little too sane about what the statistics are. But at the same time, you also have to develop an attitude of that, the opposite sanity, where you say, hey, this is tough. At some point, I need to cut tackle and get out of here, right? So how do you recommend founders cultivate that? Like, how do you maintain both of those ideas in your head at the same time?
My first answer is going to be a little bit biased towards what I want to build for them before they have the big startup idea, which is these mini project based experiments and reps where they can be super confident that, oh, of course I'm going to make $500 selling print on demand t-shirts in the next month, and see how good they were at predicting how long something would take or what their odds were. Or of course I'm going to be able to generate $1,000 from this Zapier app that sends a text message to blah, 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 whatever. And let them get kind of exercise that prediction
Experimental
muscle. Or
mindset.
yeah, everything. I like the idea of applying the scientific method to almost everything in entrepreneurship, where it's you have a
Same.
hypothesis, predict what's going to happen, how long it's going to take, and and then see how close you were to that happening, and doing that on
Hmm.
microcosmic levels. So we're not just talking about the big picture thing where the prediction is for 5 years from now, we're going to be at this $1 billion valuation or whatever, where now you've gone down a path that you maybe shouldn't have. But wait, I forget what was the other. That was my selfish way of answering that question with my microcosms projects. But what was the initial question? It was, how did they overcome the?
How do they keep the both of those ideas in their head at the same time, about like spitting in the face of reality, but at the same time knowing when to quit and move on to
Yeah,
something different?
I think. Well, first of all, I think even just people like you and I having these conversations and
Hmm.
letting people see the odds, and so like, and people get inspired by the wrong thing sometimes. I call it misguided motivation, where like,
Hmm.
what's the famous Steve Jobs quote? The people crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that do. Not who am I to criticize the Steve Jobs quote, but it's slightly backwards. It's if you think you're hold on. If you change the world, you were one of the people who were crazy enough to think you could. But there are still millions of people who think they're crazy, who are crazy enough to think they can change the world, who never will. So it's
Right.
like, it's the correlation
And
causation
it's
confusion.
backwards. Yeah, causation is backwards there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's so it's really just a
Actually,
case of,
there's something I'd like to talk about right there that's
yeah,
super important, I think, and in the line of a lot of our conversation, actually. A lot of founders get correlation and causation mixed up, where founders look at Google and look at Facebook or Meta and look at various companies that are successful, and they look at how these companies operate and they think, oh, hey, if I operate like that company, I'll have the success that they had, which in actuality, it's frequently the opposite. let's look at Google for an example. Like Google creates a lot of products and throws away a lot of products, right? They can do that because they have an unlimited money spigot. If you happen to find an unlimited money spigot, please go do whatever you want with your business. Like do weird stuff. I don't care. But the founders that we interact with and the founders that we care about do not have unlimited money spigots. And as a result, have to operate in a vastly different way. And as a result, people model themselves after places like Google, get that correlation and get that causation flipped and engage in radically dangerous activities, right?
Yep. And that's also one of the things that I love talking about. When you only hear about the success stories, it's very tempting to be like, this successful company did X and Y and Z. Therefore, if I do X and Y and Z, I will have a greater chance of success myself. If you can't compare the success stories with a statistically relevant and representative number of failures, then how do you know how many of the failures also did X, Y, and Z? Which is part of why I think I told you about this. I basically spent about 5 years intentionally studying, analyzing, interviewing 500 failed founders.
Mm-hmm.
And the average aspiring founder is not going to possibly have the time or the interest to go get that kind of statistically relevant representative sample size of data from failures. So basically I feel like, all right, I did it for you. So now I can advise and mentor and coach from a perspective, not only from my own personal experiences, which is what most mentors and advisors are going from, but also from the perspective of this huge sample size, which includes a handful of big successes, but significantly more failures. And yeah, if that XYZ example, you can't possibly know if the successful company succeeded because of those things, in spite of those things, or regardless of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Those are three very different things. So like you copying those things, and you also don't know the nuance involved where, like you were talking about this, if you've got unlimited budget, sure, try this marketing channel and this marketing channel and this marketing channel. If you
do whatever you want.
I mean, whether it's the difference between B2C and B2B or super well-funded versus bootstrapped, like there are so many differences that apply and that change what is good advice and what is not good advice, and what is a best practice and what should not be considered a best practice. And it's really just a question of seeing more and doing more so that you can better identify what advice you should be following. And I think a lot of mentors and advisors don't necessarily have that perspective to be able to share, because a lot of mentors and advisors give what they feel is best advice from their perspective. The other big thing that's never asked by the founders, I think, and particularly by the mentors and advisors, is what's the goal? And is the goal to optimize for the best chance at that 0.1% chance of billion-dollar unicorn? Or is the goal to optimize for, I want to turn this into something that is a good lifestyle business that kicks out a few $1 million a year? Or is the goal to prevent against catastrophic failure that ruins my life?
So you mentioned the 500 failed startup founders. What sort of trends did you see in that? Like, what sort of non-obvious things can we extract from that, given that we have you as a resource here?
So when you see traditional lists of top 10 reasons why startups fail, they've got the traditional stuff on there. For example, ran out of money, or never found product market fit. There's a handful.
Also ran out of money, right?
That's the number of them that all, if you dig a little deeper, end up being the same thing.
It's essentially ran out of money, 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 and ran out of money, right?
But now, so I kind of created this fun little, my inquisitive 5-year-old methodology of just saying, but why, a million times until we drill down to something. So it's like, we ran out of money, but why? Well, because investors wouldn't fund us. But why? Well, we never found product market fit. But why? Well, I guess some of our assumptions were wrong. But why? Well, I guess we were a little bit too optimistic and enthusiastic and positive, and we'd never done this before. And it all drills down to, we'd never really done this before, or we didn't have enough experience, or we hadn't seen enough, done enough, gotten enough reps under our belt. So we were just figuring it out as we went. And there's lots of advice in startup world about the value of figuring it out as you go, learning to fly the plane as you're, or learning to or building the plane as you're flying it, or learning to fly the plane as you
Exactly.
go, whatever. And again, that's a correlation, causation, confusion thing too, because it's like, just because you hear about some success stories that did it that way does not by any means imply, or it shouldn't imply, that that is the best way to do things, or that that increases your chance of success, when quite the opposite. I think it decreases your chance for success, which is also why second, third, fourth, 12th time founders tend to be more successful than first time founders, because there's less that they're
Exactly.
figuring out. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel every single time. So a lot of the stuff that I've recognized, and a lot of the times I would have these conversations, not really interviews, but more conversations with some of these founders, and try to, and you got to be sensitive, because depending on how recently they had failed or what they're feeling about it, not everybody is interested in being
Yeah.
super self-aware and dissecting what went wrong for the last however many years of their life.
For
But a
most of
lot
them,
of it,
it's personal and it's kind of like their baby, right?
it's
Like,
their baby. And it's also why we don't get enough founder failure data in general, is because in a lot of cases, they're embarrassed. Which they shouldn't be. It's what's going
they
to happen
absolutely
to
should not
most
be.
people. I mean, there's such this disconnect about how, with their shame, and a lot of times they'll just quietly slink away, and like they'll
And
cut
a
off.
lot of that is like a dark flip side of kind of the hype that we see too, right? Because we hear so much about the success stories that everyone that fails is like, oh no, is it me? Was it my idea? Was it part of the execution? Did I not have the right people, etc.? When it's just like,
That's normal.
to a
Like
certain
that's
extent,
what.
you just got to keep getting back on the horse with it.
Yep. And that's the other thing, is that people don't recognize how many failures were likely in the path of most successful entrepreneurs before they succeeded. So I think the best piece of startup advice that most people are not giving to founders, or that founders are not hearing, is that they need to budget their personal runway. We hear about the term runway
Yes.
in terms of startups and how much runway a startup has. We rarely talk about the runway for an entrepreneur, and how
Mm-hmm.
much time and money and mental health the
Mm-hmm.
founder has for their entrepreneurial journey as a founder, whether it's with this specific venture they're on or not. And if we were really being honest with founders and trying to give them the best advice to give them the best chance of being successful at some point in their entrepreneurial journey, it would be all about keeping your ammo dry, keeping yourself in the game long enough to learn enough, and
Absolutely.
to become, and to get some lucky breaks and meet the right people. Most of the really bad stuff that founders go through, and then they shut down their company, and then they are no longer members of ATV, or they go and have to get a job. Hopefully they can get a job. Most of those stories about the really bad stuff they go through are only heard by their closest 3, 4, 5, 10 closest friends and family. So it's not heard by aspiring founders, or who really need to hear that to be able to make their best decision on whether risk. The other thing about risk is glorified and celebrated when it really should be identified and mitigated.
And minimized.
And yes, like we
Or
celebrate these.
I would say, well, in general, minimized, but apply judicious. Because risk is a really powerful tool if you use it appropriately, right?
Sure, of course.
Again, if you're to use a poker analogy, if you go all in every hand, you're not going to stay in the game very long. But if you fold every single hand, you're going to die of 1,000 cuts, right? So you have to figure out the appropriate moments and the appropriate situations to bet big, and make sure you're betting appropriately big, not so big that you're going to lose your house, not so small that, again, you die by 1,000 cuts.
But that's a perfect analogy, because if we're talking poker, you're making your decisions on how much to bet on based on what cards you have in your hand, and based on what your knowledge is of probability and statistics. If I've got pocket
Mm-hmm.
aces, I know what my odds are now. If you were just betting blindly or didn't know the rules of poker, now, by the way, I'm not a big poker player, but
I'm
like
not great
that's a
at it
great,
either, personally.
because you've got actual data and statistics and probability, and you know what your hands are. So that's where like the idea of like encouraging people to be confident in themselves. I have a love-hate relationship with that. Yes, confidence is important, but there's a difference between earned confidence and unearned confidence. Earned
Very
confidence
true.
Earned confidence comes from data and statistics and probability and experience and testing. But unearned confidence is like, I believe in myself.
It's from the gut, right?
My parents told me to believe. If you believe it, you can achieve it. Like I hate some of these motivational posters out there that don't factor in probabilities and statistics and that just encourage blind positivity and blind optimism. And I know I would get hate from this because people are like believing in the power of manifestation and positive and the universe and the secret, all that stuff.
Nah.
Great. And that's fine.
We're going to use numbers and statistics to manifest what we want in reality, right?
Yeah. It's just, if you actually had a 10,000 foot view at what all of these, if I had a room full of 1,000 aspiring founders and I got up there and just pumped them full of confidence and you can do it, believe in yourself or whatever, we're going to get a handful of very successful founders that come out of that room. And then they're probably going to sing my praises as like, oh, I was inspired by. I use the example of the opening sequence of Shark Tank. Shark Tank, it's all about like, who's next? It could be you. If you believe it, if you believe in yourself or whatever. And it's like, we celebrate entrepreneurs. We celebrate the risk takers. It's like, yeah, you celebrate the risk takers after the risk paid off. People talk about how like, oh, startups involve risk. Well, risk is very different depending on your personal situation. If you have tons of money in the bank, if you're a trust fund kid, if you know that if you fall flat on your face, you've got wealthy parents or a wealthy spouse or whatever, and you're going to be just fine, that risk is not the same as somebody who has tons of debt, no savings, and had been living paycheck to paycheck before they took the leap, got rid of that paycheck and their health insurance and all that, and they've got 3 to 6 months to make this thing work, or they're in a lot of trouble. Those risks are not the same. I absolutely love startups. I love entrepreneurship, love everything about it. A lot of the startup advice out there wasn't necessarily intended for all founders. Like a lot of the best advice out there comes from Y Combinator and Techstars or whatever, which is basically for their portfolio companies, which have already crossed over a big hurdle and have already gotten funding and shown enough traction to get them into Y Combinator and Techstars. So that advice is intended to create $1 billion unicorn. And somehow that advice funnels down to people who are working on their pre-launch, pre-revenue, pre-product market fit startup that it's different advice. And if you follow the wrong advice that's not intended for you and your stage and your goal, well, not the best recipe. So anyway, I feel like conversations like these are awesome because it creates conversation and things to think about, not only for founders, but for other mentors and advisors and anybody who works with founders to try to like have some of these conversations. And there's no advice across the board that's going to work. There's no perspective, but as long as you're open to the idea that there's different perspectives and different things work for different people, the other side of whatever, the number of pieces of advice out there where you could literally argue the exact opposite advice for a given founder or for a given startup, it's incredible. And it's just understanding what the goal is and having the tough conversations. Is the goal to take that 1 out of 1,000 shot at becoming $1 billion unicorn? If so, great, awesome. You've decided that works for you and you've weighed the pros and cons and you understand the risk factor. Understanding the risk is the biggest piece. But if your goal is to create a $1 million, $2 million, $3 million business or whatever, that's great too. But as long as you can acknowledge that and understand that you're maybe playing a different game, you're not putting together the same investor pitch or whatever, because you're probably bootstrapping that one rather than taking institutional funding.
Absolutely. Well, Jeff, do you want to plug your pluggables?
I am actually more so than pitching any kind of product or whatever. I'm actually pitching for partners. I recognize self-awareness is a big thing for me. I recognize my strengths, my weaknesses, and some of the programs that I want to put in place are things that I think can have a huge impact on founders and future founders, but I fully recognize that I am not the best at the logistics and the operations of running programs or even selling programs into the institutions and organizations that I think can most benefit from them. So I'm kind of looking to have conversations like these with as many people as possible and kind of share what some of my programming and methodologies are all about, finding people who are at least on board and agree with some of the thoughts that I have, and kind of putting together kind of some like-minded folks that want to try to improve things from the ground up for future founders, kind of creating a minor leagues or junior varsity of entrepreneurship.
Hmm. And where can people find you?
People can find me on LinkedIn. I respond to many more LinkedIn messages than I do regular email. My email box is a zoo, but cofounderator.com is kind of the umbrella organization that I'm trying to run most of my stuff through. So it's the idea behind it is an incubator accelerator model specifically targeting founders and co-founders and kind of helping people at that kind of earliest stage of entrepreneurship. So cofounderator.com will probably be where whatever the latest and greatest is that I'm working on will be posted.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for joining us. This has been fantastic. I always love talking about concepts like survivorship bias and just making sure that founders get the information they need to succeed. And for everybody watching, I hope that you've enjoyed. I hope that you've learned a lot. I mean, there's a ton of really useful and a ton of really interesting content here that I think is, God, very different from a lot of the content that's out there in the ecosystem as we've been talking about, right? And so I hope that you all just take a lot of this to heart, learn from it, grow from it, and just continue building the way that you need to just stay in the game so that you can survive, ship, and scale. So thank all of you for joining us as well. And I hope you all have a fantastic day. Peace.